Hello, welcome to the MuseScore Café for today, Wednesday, July 24th, 2019. Welcome to those of you who are watching live, and as always, feel free to be participating in discussion, giving me your comments and questions. My name is Marc Sabatella. I'm the Director of Education for MuseScore, and this is my weekly series of these live interactive chats that I do, and I usually pick a topic to talk about and kind of, stay with that topic at least to start with, and then if people have other things they want to discuss, I'm happy to discuss those too. So the topic that I am talking about today is it's about a new series that I am planning on launching, and I have mentioned before during these cafes that I intend to be putting out some actual courses to teach music theory and composition, and I've been giving a lot of thought to what that might look like, how I might structure these things, and what topics I really want to cover and how I want to present the material, etc. And I really have more ideas than I know what to do with. And so this is one of my ideas that I am definitely going to do. And I say definitely because now I'm putting it out there that I'm doing it. So let me talk about what this is going to be. The idea is going to be that I'm going to have certain scores that I will post to musescore.com, and then have a video that goes with the score that kind of talks about what goes into that composition, whether it's about the melodic material, the harmonic material, the form, and anything that's relevant to talking about what makes that composition tick. And I want to keep this as open as possible as far as what kind of material I'm talking about. Well, like for instance, am I talking about pieces like this very familiar piece here? Very familiar if you're a beginning pianist. Anyhow, let's hear it. Right, that's one of the pieces played as a sort of a, first year piano recital kind of piece by a lot of beginning pianists. So pieces like this, well, maybe this simple or much more complicated classical pieces, but also, jazz pieces, pop music, all sorts of other kinds of things, for piano, for chorus, for orchestra, whatever. It doesn't really matter. I want to look at music in general. Now, I also have to say, I'm probably going to be using some of my own compositions, because then I can really talk about the process, not just speculating or not just analyzing the finished product, but really giving insight into the process of composing. So I want to make sure I do some of that, but I don't want it to just be about my own music, because then that's of limited appeal. Hopefully some people like some of my music. So the idea is that I'm going to talk about what makes some of these pieces tick. So let's talk a little bit about this piece. As again, sort of a preview of the kinds of things I'm going to talk about. So the first thing I'm going to do, let's close the inspector. We don't need that. Oh, by the way, for many years, including when I learned this piece was believed. Hey, Marcus. Oh, Martin. Sorry. There's a Marcus too, right? There is, who follows this sometimes. So when I first learned this piece, it was believed to have been written by Bach, although there was always some amount of doubt in people's mind, because it was collected in the Anna Magdalena notebook. It was a notebook he collected for teaching pieces, and most of the pieces weren't really attributed, so we knew he wrote some of them. Some of them were pieces written by his friends. Some of them were written in her handwriting, where she transcribed them. So this was one that wasn't really known for a long time, but somewhere like in the 70s, it was finally figured out, okay, this is actually not Bach's piece, but is by Christian Petzold. So anyhow, the form of this piece, so when we say a minuet first, what is that is? Well, that was a dance form in 3/4 time. So it's a 3/4 dance. And when I say a dance form, do people dance to it? Well, sure, they did. But it means a couple other things aside from that when it talks about just music. It means a certain regularity of structure. It means there's probably not going to be time signature changes, not that there often would be. But it also means things like these repeated sections are present that could possibly be opened up for longer dances or shortened by not taking the repeats. So, the convention is we'll take the repeats. But the form of this of minuets, this one in particular anyhow, would often be there's a main theme that's repeated and then a secondary theme here that's repeated. So the main theme is the one that we just heard, the and so on. I should play the whole piece. Yeah, might as well play the rest of the piece, but only turn repeats off. Repeats are already off, because I think I was already playing with them off. Okay. I'll talk only a little. So this is like a secondary theme within the theme. Return to the first theme. Repeat of that secondary theme. Now the real second theme. And then even a third theme. So that's the piece. So when I described this theme, it's really a 4-measure theme. Sometimes we analyze these things. In fact, do I have my education? Yes, I do. I've got my education workspace here. Let me just go ahead and add some annotations. How about that? I'll add this guy and call it A. I'll just drag, because why not? And then I think I'll just copy this thing and then paste it here, but I'll call it B. And then here is now another return to the A theme, and here is the B theme. So I could call that A, B, A, B. Interesting. I'm just looking at the positioning of these things and guessing why they're positioned as they are, but I'm not going to worry. Oh, okay, because it was applying the same offset. All right. So anyhow, these are the themes that I've now labeled A, B, A, B, and that's pretty typical. But even within this A theme, we see ba da 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 dum, and then ba do da 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 dum dum. Right? That's a call and response within the theme. So really, at some level, there's 2 measures of music here, and then those same 2 measures were reused here. And now within the B theme, we have ba da 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 dum, and then we have ba da 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 dum. Right? This is also reuse of a 1-measure cell, and then boo-doo-doo, boo-doo. So we have a third little, we have one snippet of melody here that's repeated, a second snippet of melody here that's repeated, and then a third snippet of melody there that's used. And then in the repetition of this here, we have the A theme again, pretty much exactly, a slight difference in the accompaniment. This measure versus the more elaborated version here. I should mention also that in the Baroque, this sort of thing, like writing this out with variation, yeah, okay, they wrote it out that way because they had to put something down on paper. But it's important to realize that during the Baroque era, improvisation was a thing. I mean, it really was. I mean, Bach was well known as an improviser. That's what he was known for, as much as being a composer, an improviser at the organ in particular. So the modern idea that classical music is meant to be played exactly as notated is really kind of a modern invention. It's not really consistent with how it was actually performed in the Baroque. So these sorts of variations would likely have been thrown in by Bach himself, perhaps even when he wrote it out for Anna Magdalena, but perhaps he wrote it out, perhaps she wrote it out, perhaps he improvised it. I don't know if that was part of the original or not, but certainly in performance, those are the kinds of elaborations that he would be just throwing in, just because that's what an improviser does. So we have within this whole first section, some amount of form going on here, really making a lot of use. This little section here is really the same thing. I could even get a little further and call that A1, and then here call this guy should have copied it before applying the manual adjustment is what I should have done. Okay, so this is like a A1, A2, or a, repetition of that A theme. It's really making a lot of use out of a little material. I mean, we've got basically 2 measures composed here, a 3rd measure composed here, and then a 4th measure composed here. There's really 4 unique measures of music here that is then stretched out for 16 measures by then repeating that A theme exactly, and then repeating the B theme exactly, but with a slightly different tail at the end of it here. This is really 4 measures of music stretched out to be 16, and then what? Then there's repeats to double it. So we've got 32 measures of music out of really 4 measures of melodic material. And that's really important because A, it means when you're composing, give me a second here. Something on my screen. I'm sure you don't see that, right? You see me. It's both important as a composer to reuse material because it can speed the process of composing. Not that the composing is a race, but from a listener perspective, reuse of material is important because it helps lend cohesion to a piece. To hear an idea and then hear that same idea again. We might say that some music takes this to an extreme, whether it's minimalist classical music or whether it's a certain kind of pop music or something that just really is all about repetition of a hook. But I mean, this is the same principle at play here. And then we have our real secondary theme. So I called this A and B, but really this is all the A section. So this is like big A and big B, and then within big A we got little a, little b. Does that make sense? That's a way that we might talk about this. So I could actually have called this little A1, little A2. Call that sometimes we use this prime, and I didn't mean that. And then this guy, little b, right? Little a, little b, but then also note that this section here is big A. And that over here is finally big B. All right, some questions or comments? Cool. So not sure how complicated I'm planning on going, and realistically, I don't know. I'm looking for input, and I figure there's value in everything. And by everything, I mean there's value in looking at really simple music. I mean, this is a fairly simple piece, but there's some stuff going on also. So looking at really simple music is useful, but so is looking at much more complex music. Now, if it's much more complex music, realistically, I could spend hours. I could spend a whole semester, right, going over, say, the Rite of Spring or something. I wouldn't be the most qualified person to do that, but I could take a piece of music and look at, if it's like hundreds of measures long for lots of instruments and all, there's a lot involved in analyzing that. So what it might mean is taking big pieces but looking at small excerpts of them, or choosing only to look at one aspect of it, like the orchestration overall orchestration choices, or only look at the form, which is what we're talking about here, or only look at the harmonic choices used in the transition to the development section, or whatever. So there's all sorts of ways that as I develop this idea, we can essentially see what sticks, is my thinking. This series will be open-ended. As I said, I have more ideas than I know what to do with right now. This is one of them that I think is going to be valuable. But also, in the process of doing this, I'm using language that I'm having to explain. Like, I'm explaining what I mean by big A and little a and big B and little b. And realistically, if there was just a course teaching basics of analysis that talked about form, and then had the general idea of what it means to talk about form, then I could point people there, and then come in this series and say, okay, now that you know what I mean when I talk about these things, just do it, right? So those are the kinds of things that I'm still sorting out, is how to divide all this stuff up so that it can be of the most use. I want to be able to have some lessons or some courses or whatever where I'm explaining the language. Most of the language is fairly typical, but every theory textbook teaches it differently, and especially when you get into the jazz realm, there's that much more personalization of the language. And so really I need to explain my language, or my way of doing the language. I mean, even just simple things like Roman numeral analysis. Do you use lowercase letters for your minor chords, or do you put the letter M there? You go through a music library and look at all the theory textbooks, and you'll see it's probably not 50-50, but there's significant numbers doing it either way. I like the lowercase minor chords personally. So yeah, talking about the form and the fact that this second section really has a totally different melody. And unlike what is now considered virtually standard, the original melody doesn't come back, right? This piece does not specify a DC, a da capo al fine, going back to the beginning and then restating the original theme. And that's kind of an interesting point in itself, because it's almost taken for granted now that we are going to hear things come back again and again, not just episodically. By episodically, I mean this piece, that beginning melody we got to hear several times, but then when it's done. It doesn't come back. After that 16 bars is repeated, we never hear bum ba da 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 dum bum bum again. We hear all this other stuff. Now, is this other stuff related? Well, okay, yeah. It's still based on the motif of quarter note 4/8 notes, quarter note 4/8 notes, and variations on that idea. This little bump boo dum bump boo dum, that's like a new little idea that came out of nowhere, and was just introduced to introduce it. So, okay, question on copying parts. Let me finish this thought, and I'll come back to copying parts, which is what I was talking about last week. This idea of repetition and bringing back the original theme is kind of interesting, because that became a thing, and yeah, it was a thing in the Baroque, but it wasn't necessarily considered like, oh, you got to do this. I mean, most Renaissance music was structured similarly. You had these Renaissance motets with a whole section at the beginning that has a theme developed, and then another theme that's developed, and then another theme that's developed, and they don't come back to the first one. And yet, by the time you get to things like classical sonatas and so forth, yeah, you're going to have an exposition, you have this other stuff, and then the recapitulation, or in a jazz context, you play the head, the melody to a piece, then you improvise, then you play the head again. It's essentially the same as a classical sonata form. So talking about form is an interesting thing in itself. There's plenty of outs I can talk about as far as the way the counterpoint works here, the way the harmony works there. So in any given one of these making of pieces, I might look at some or all of these. It would have to be a pretty short piece for me to look at every possible thing there is to look at on it. Even this piece, it would take hours to really talk about everything. All right, so let's see. The question I'm talking about parts. Is it okay to use a passage of a piece but morph it? Copying parts. Okay, so I guess I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I thought maybe you meant what I was talking about last week of generating parts from a score and formatting them, but now I see, is it okay to use? So are we talking about this idea that we're reusing this little melodic material here? I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Paul. But I will make up an answer while we wait and see if you can clarify that for me. What I would say is, if you're talking about using melodic material from another composer, that's a time-honored thing. Lots of composers have written pieces based on themes from other composers, and it is in that case expected that you're going to make some significant enough changes to it to make it your own. And from a copyright perspective, that's not generally considered a problem if you really use things like a whole chunk of music exactly as is. Now we are talking about a problem, but if you're just using a snippet of melody from, yes, there's value in both. I mean, the idea of assembling something out of borrowing bits of melody but changing changing the harmony to suit your purposes, this is something I personally do all the time, recommend highly, and it's really at the heart of what jazz musicians in particular do when we play a particular standard. You know, there might be a piece, All the Things You Are, or whatever, that's been played hundreds, thousands of times, but every person who plays it differently might play the chords a little bit different. So good, glad I interpreted that correctly. But also, you yourself, if you are reusing material, it's really can be powerful to find a little section of melody and then imagine it in different ways. Like here, we heard it with a full triad. Here, it comes back without the full triad. In fact, there's no root here, right? This is a G triad here. But when it comes back, it's played without the G. Why? Because really he wanted just a two-voice texture. This is actually an important thing. This piece is mostly just about one note in the right hand, one note in the left hand. It's two voices. But at the beginning of the piece, it started off, he wanted to hear the root because that's kind of important to hear at the beginning of the piece, but the melody note was the fifth, not hearing the third. That would not really fly. It would have in the Renaissance, but it doesn't in the Baroque so much. Yeah, there might be context in which it does, but not this kind of music, not music that's so overtly tonal like this. So we got to throw that third in there. And once he does that, it's like, heck with it, I'm going to just put the whole triad down there, right? It's possible someone else might have played it and said, nah, why bother playing the D twice? I'll just leave the D out. People might obsess about that and say, oh, it's that way on that original manuscript, but you have to remember this was recopied by Anna based on Bach telling her about Christian's piece and improvising and all these other variables that went in. It's important in this context not to get too hung up on details like that. But what's really interesting is it would be possible to totally look at this a little differently. Like, I could, for instance, let me change this around a little bit. I'm going to make, I'm looking for opportunities. All right, so I just made a little line happen here. In fact, why not? I'm just going to make them eighth notes all the way. I just made my own little variation here in which I created this descending line, and I'm looking at what's happening harmonically. I've created myself a little E minor chord, a little 6 chord here. I've created myself a 5 chord here. It's really a 1 6 4, a 1 chord in second inversion, resolving to a 5 7. Oh, doubled? No, I don't want to double that. So I guess I'll make this A. So I could have just held the D. In fact, maybe I'll just do that. I'll just hold the D. That was my original thing. This E flat. Now we could say this is just a passing tone in the left hand, but it actually creates a sound here. This E flat to the A interval here, this tritone that's resolving outwards, this is actually quite suggestive of an augmented 6th chord. It's not the whole augmented 6th chord. In fact, it's missing the part that we would need to actually call it an augmented 6th chord, which is the augmented 6th above the E flat. We'd need a C sharp here. So let me play this just the way I just did this. I mean, this just off the top of my head did this, but I think it's going to sound pretty cool. Yeah, let me slow that down. I'll bring up the play panel for that, actually, rather than changing the tempo. Play panel, tempo. Okay. All right. So that's what that sounds like. And actually, at this point, I do want to hear what it sounds like with that A. Yeah, I like that better, actually. This sound that happened right there, let's pause when we get there. Oops. Yeah, I should slow it down even more. That I just turned this into something that's much more reminiscent of something, you know, Beethoven might have done or something like that. Not that Bach wouldn't have done that, but this type of chromaticism is now pushing a little the boundaries of what Bach would have done. But as I said, it's actually quite reminiscent of a pretty common device in the classical era, if not as much in the Baroque. And in order for this to be heard as a true augmented sixth chord, I said it needs a C sharp. And then it would have to resolve to a D. Whoops, let me add a D to that chord. So let's listen to this passage now. There we go. And let's add a B on there. Okay, so I'm playing with this. I'm having fun with this. Why? This has nothing to do with getting inside the piece, right? This is just about me exploring it. Well, to me, that's why you get inside a piece. You don't get inside of a piece just to like say, oh, now I get it. It's so that you can say, oh, now I get it. So I can see how I can then build on it. Whether you're interested in building your own arrangement of this melody, or whether you're interested in borrowing some of the ideas of this piece and creating your own piece. Like maybe now that I've heard this thing, I decide, you know what, I'm tossing all of it and I'm just keeping this little passage right here. This one beat right there, and I'm going to build a piece built on that beat. Well, that's fine. Do that. To me, that is why we study pieces, why we study existing pieces, to understand how they tick so that we can then build our own pieces. That's, I guess, why I do it, and that's why that is part of my goal in producing a series like what I'm talking about, is to get you to understand how this music is functioning so that you can create your own music using those techniques and hopefully building on them. So let me just play that whole measure again now. Yeah, there you go. I like that. I actually want this guy now, because now that this is a seventh of a chord, which it wasn't really before, I want it to resolve down, and so this guy's going to come down also. So there we go. So I took that piece and I've just now modified it in ways that it's way different than what Bach or Christian Petzold would have envisioned for the piece. Not that they wouldn't have done that in some other context, but maybe not on this piece in this spot. But by really looking at what's going on harmonically with it, and as far as the form and everything else, I want to learn what makes it tick so I can do my own stuff. And that's kind of what I want to inspire you guys with. So as I said, I'm going to be doing a series. When I say a series, I don't mean like it's going to be necessarily like a regular weekly thing. It's just going to be when I have a piece, because I'm going to put more time into producing these. It's not going to be me just rambling. It's going to be me really collecting my thoughts, having notes. And if it's, say, a half hour long, it's going to be a half hour of, really focused, getting in depth and not repeating myself and going off on tangents and so forth. I just made up a half hour, who knows, but that's how long I've been talking. Let me just briefly mention something else about this piece that's typical, other than the form issue, that's also worth pointing out, is the tonal structure in terms of how the keys work. I mean, this piece, it says minuet in G, and it's in G. And if we look at the chords, there's, other than the ones, the accidentals I added, there's not a single accidental to be seen in here. The chords this was all a one chord, 4 chord, 1 chord. Essentially I would call this a 5 chord. I would call this a D chord in which we're never hearing the third. Here's my D, here's my A, here's a C, which is the 7th. I suppose I should return the tempo to normal, you think? I think I can double click this. Yes, I can double click it to return it to 100. That works with some controls, not all of them. So some people would say, no, we never heard the F sharp, this isn't a 5 chord, this isn't really a D chord, it's an A minor chord, right? But listen to what happened the second time. Right here, he gives us the explicit F sharp, so it was there. And 5 to 1 is such an expected thing. Anyhow, there's a 1 chord, 4, 1, and then 5, 1, 1, and then a 5 again here. Right? Boom, dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. Is what's happening. It's all built on 1, 4, and 5. Coming back to the 1 every time it needs to, at the beginning of a phrase or at the end of a phrase. The second section in this piece starts on that 1 chord, and then we have our first accidental. And that accidental really is indicating a change of key to D. Here, this is the 5 chord in the key of D, and he elaborates that 5 chord a little longer. 5, 5, 1, and then we hear this now as a 1 chord. Even though the D chord was the 5 chord in the key of G, he has hit us hard enough with this A chord here, the 5 of the 5, the 5 chord of the D chord. He's hit us hard enough with this 5 of 5 that when we finally hear 5, it's like, oh, that's actually 1. So that's a modulation, and that's this idea of modulating to the key of the 5 is pretty ubiquitous in this type of music. Sometimes he would just hit you right off with a 5 chord here. So here he kind of eases his way into it. He gives you a 1, he gives you a 5 that you still hear as a 5, 5, and now by going to this E chord, this is the 6 chord in the key of E minor, in the key of G, but it's the 2 chord in the key of D, and so he's giving us a 2-5. This is 2 to 5 in the key of D. So that's setting up the key of D. So this is really common in this music, that this second section here would modulate to the key of the 5, and then that 5 then takes on a 7th, so that I said it sounds like 1. It sounds like we're in the key of D at this point. You could have called the piece done right then and said, oh, we ended in D. But he remembers, no, we're in G. So he plays that D long enough for you to say, yep, that was the 1 chord in the key of D, I'm satisfied. And then he puts the 7th on it to help reestablish, no, that really was the 5 chord in the key of G, and now we're coming back to G. Check that out. One, and then 4, 1, 5, 1, 5, and then some motion. 5, 1, 5, 1. Sorry, I'm not good at singing the roots while I'm thinking and talking. I'm better at it than you might have thought from that, actually, but in any case, it is what it is. So, is all of that notated? Yep, that is totally. So this, if I were notating this, I would say I will use, I have Campagna set up for this chart. I would say that that's 2 of 5, and this is 5 of 5, is how I would notate that. Now, some people would look at this and say, well, it's that, but it's also just 6. So they would say it's 6. Oops. Zoom in so y'all can see what I'm doing here. I'm 6, but it's also 2 of 5. So this is a way of indicating that. And then this also I should, in fact, this time I'm going to use the inspector so you can see how that works. I'm going to close the play panel. I don't need it anymore. I can now move this guy to verse 2. That's a MuseScore 3 feature that I don't know that I've mentioned before because it's just sort of a little thing, but it was a glaring deficiency in MuseScore 2 that you couldn't easily move things. So this idea that now you can see, oh, 2 of 5, and then 5 of 5, and then finally the 5. And then some people put in a little bracket here to just sort of visually separate out that this is either 6 in the original key or it's 2 of 5. And or some people would notate this by saying 5:2. And then we can just call this 5. And then you can read this as in the key of 5, this is the 2. Hey, my touchpad is going wonky, sorry. In the key of 5, that's the 2, and that's the 5. Anyhow, this idea that this piece is going to, within that short period of time, modulate temporarily to the 5 and then come back to 1, ubiquitous, by which I mean almost every piece of this type does that. To the 5 specifically. In more modern times now, the idea of modulating for what we'd call the bridge of a piece, yeah, that's pretty typical, but now we go every which way. 5 is actually not one of the more common places to go anymore. Now we're more likely to go to a more distantly related key. But the nice thing about going to the 5 is there's only one note different between the key of G and the key of D. There's only one note different, and that's that C sharp. So you introduce that, and now you've set up, okay, we're going to 5, and then as soon as you reach that 5, there's a time-tested way of coming back to 1, and that is, now that we've reached that D chord, all you got to do is stick a 7th on it, and now he's all ready to come back to 1. So that was such a cliche that they really had, I won't say no choice but to do it, but boy, they used that device as often as they ever felt like. So these are the kinds of things I'm going to talk about in this series, and yeah, I don't know exactly where I'm going with it, which pieces I'm going to cover, but the idea of looking at existing music and getting inside it a little bit from an understanding what makes it tick and understanding what opportunities it presents to then build upon is something I want to do. And so, like I said, it's not going to be like a weekly series. Maybe I'll, every month or two put up a new piece because I'm going to put some work into them. And, there won't be, I don't know how long I'll continue. I'll just put them out when I feel like it, basically. So that is my preview of this The Making Of series. That's what I'm calling it for now. Other topics that I know I want to talk about coming up. I mean, we're getting close to the end of the Google Summer of Code, and so I'll be excited to show you some of the new stuff that's coming from the students who have been hard at work implementing new things. I also, I believe I also had mentioned that accessibility, the use of MuseScore by blind musicians, or just in general how blind musicians deal with music and computers for creating music, has been an interest of mine for some time, and it's really kind of like now a big focus of mine just over just this summer and going forward into this fall, where I'll be working with a student. So I've been doing some work that I'll be excited to talk about. Probably I'll want to talk about that next week is my guess. So I think I don't see any other questions. So I think I'm going to leave you with that and hope that you enjoyed looking at some things about this piece. And yeah, I glossed over a lot of details because I was more just speaking off the cuff and responding to what interested me at the moment, and left out a lot of details and so forth. When I do these, I'll put the requisite thought into like making sure I stick to a, if not a script, at least a list of bullet points and cover things and really cover things nice and clearly. So yeah, rewind. Okay, cool. So I will leave you at that, and I will talk to you all next week. Thanks. Bye.